Here begins. Welcome to the Delta Wordweavers on April 10th, 2022. So today we may have Earth stories, we're going to have April stories, and an assemblage of spring things too. Welcome to all, and I'll turn it over to Sarah to just get us started. Sarah.
Okay, so we will all be muted during a telling as to not distract from the teller. And please block your video if you're a mover, a wiggler. I block myself because I am in constant movement and don't want to pull away from the attention to the teller. So if you're going to be eating or drinking or getting up and moving around, or if you're a wiggler like me, please do your video so that we give all of our attention to our wonderful tellers. And we request that you do the deaf sign for clapping like that. If we can see you. Or you can use the response icons at the bottom of your screen to clap or ask a question. And there will be time for teller feedback before the break and at the end of the telling. Okay, now we move on to our very first teller, who is our very own Marian Ferrante. She's our featured teller, and she is one of 3 educators who founded Delta Wordweavers some 40 years ago. Wow. She's a retired speech pathologist. She continues with her hobby and her passion to tell and teach oral storytelling to both children and adults. Today, she's giving a presentation, which is an example of how you can be inspired by one story to make up one of your own. Marian, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. My first story is called The Tailor. Long ago in a village lived a poor tailor. He made overcoats for many, many people of the village, but he never made one for himself, even though an overcoat is just what he wanted. But he was too poor. But he did, bit by bit, cereal, some fabric, and he got it. There was enough now to make an overcoat for himself, but he cut it ever so carefully as not to waste any fabric, and he made a very fine overcoat. Oh, this was a wonderful overcoat. It kept him so warm in the winter. He wore it and wore it. Oh, he wore it and wore it for years and years. He wore it and wore it and wore it till it was all worn out. Well, he thought it was worn out, but when he looked at it, there was just enough fabric to make a jacket. So he cut and cut and sewed, and from that overcoat, he made that jacket. He could wear this even more often than that overcoat. He wore it and wore it. Oh, he wore it and wore it till he was all worn out. And at least he thought it was worn out, but he took it off to see, there is just enough to make a vest. And he put it on his cutting table. He cut and sewed, and he made a very fine vest. He could wear that vest inside, outside, all seasons of the year. It was a wonderful vest, and he wore it and wore it and wore it till it was all worn out. He looked at that. He thought it was worn out, but no, there was just enough fabric to make a cap. And he cut and sewed, and he made a cap. He wore that, till it was almost worn out. And from that, he made a button, and that button that he had sewed, he wore it every single day, that button, and he loved that button. It was worn out, and he thought, but he looked at that button and he saw there was just enough left to make a story, and I have told it to you. That story comes from Just Enough to Tell a Story by Nancy Schimmel. Nancy lives in Oakland, California, and I have permission to tell her version of this story. And she got it from a song. She was at a concert listening to an old Yiddish folk song, and it was that story, but the songster made it into a song. Nancy was the first to turn it into a story and then got the permission to put it in her book. And she gave Marion permission. Actually, she gave me, here's another question for our workshop. She gave me permission like 20 years ago. Is the permission still good? I think so, but just in case, and also just to reconnect with Nancy, I got permission again because we're dealing with the issues. So that is a story. And I'm here today to give you an example of how you can take a little story that's kind of fun. For me, this one was fun because there's repetition. It's fun to deliver that repetition to the audience. And when I tell it to the children, they like it and they anticipate. Were you anticipating what could come next? Maybe so. And then something happened in my life, or at least to my friend Kathy, that I developed into a new story, but the pattern is from the tailor. Here it is. I've known Kathy for 55 years because we met at California, Sacramento State College in the dorms. Well, the years have taken us to different states. When she comes to visit me, she is visiting Antioch, California, population of 111,000. She visits Fred and I. We're in a 2-story tract house. When I visit Kathy, I'm in Otisville, Michigan, population 900. She lives there with her partner, Ann, and Ann's mother, Rosie. Otisville, I said, has 900. Now, they live in a geodesic dome home. It was prefabricated. It was assembled on the property. This property was owned by Ann's grandfather and had been divvied up over the years. When I visited her 50 years ago, Kathy took me out to that big old barn because from this geodesic dome home, on one side is this beautiful tiny little lake, and on the other side, there's a barn out there. And in that, we went in the barn and it was pretty big. There was like a loft and there was still hay, no animals. You could tell there had been a couple horses, a couple cows out there. Oh, I could smell a leather smell. And I looked up on the wall. Yes, there was old horse tack hanging there on rusty nails. No horses, but the stall was there. Today, only the cats sleep in the hay. In one corner were carpenter tools. They had put garden tools in the other, and their bicycles were out there for storage. I visited again 45 years ago. And when I went on that visit, Kathy said, we cannot go in that barn. Look at it. And at that barn, it was leaning and creaking in the wind. We do not go out there. It's too dangerous. And we did not. About a year later, Kathy called me up. Marion, the barn collapsed. Rosie was here. She tells us she heard this huge noise outside, and it didn't scare her because she knew what it was. Rosie tells us she went to the window to look out to see this huge plume of dust settling down. It took 20 minutes for it to settle down. By the time Kathy and Ann got back from Mass, the dust had settled, but there was a huge pile of old barn wood just everywhere on this big pile of the ground. Well, Kathy and Ann looked at that wood pile. What are we going to do with all that wood? And they thought and they thought. What are we going to do with it? What are we going to do? Anne said, I know what, we'll build a workshop. And that is what they did. They sawed and sawed and hammered, and they made a beautiful workshop. They made a carpenter table in one area, a garden table in another. A garden table. Why, that is where Rosie could put her seedlings before she put them in the fruit and vegetable garden. That is where Anne could put her seedlings for the dahlias. Anne loves dahlias. And later I visited her in the garden. Anne has beautiful dahlias of purple and reds and yellows in a garden. It was a fine idea. But there was still so much wood on the side of the workshop now. What are we going to do with all that wood? So they thought and they thought. Kathy said, I know what. Let's build raised garden boxes for Rosie. You know, she's getting older and to bend over and go down to the ground for her garden. And that's what they did. So they sawed and they sawed and they hammered and they hammered and they fashioned together raised garden boxes for Rosie. It was wonderful. Time passed. There was still wood in the pile. What are we going to do with all that wood? I know what. Let's build a cradle because Anne, your brother Tom, they're having a baby pretty soon. And that's what they did. They sawed and they sawed and they hammered and hammered, tacked and tacked and sanded and sanded and sanded and sanded and sanded some more. So there was not one more place with a sliver on it. They made a beautiful cradle. And baby Sean rocked in that cradle. And a couple years later, baby Chantel rocked in that cradle, and Grant, the nieces and nephews, were born in those years. But aside of that workshop, there was still some more wood. What are we going to do with all that wood? They thought. I know what, said Kathy. Christmas is coming. Let's make some toys for the nieces and nephews. And that's what they did. They sawed and they sawed and they tacked and they tacked and they sanded and sanded and sanded and sanded and sanded some more so as not to have one splinter left. And they made little toy trucks. Why, they found the knotted woods and put those down for the wheels on the trucks. And they put bottle caps for the headlights. Oh, the trucks were enjoyed. And then they fashioned and sanded down to make a little cradle, one in the same fashion of the first one they'd made. And the children loved their toys and they passed them on to their cousins and their sisters and brothers. It was wonderful. So things were used, the wood was used, but there was still wood left in the pile. We've got to get rid of that wood. What are we going to do? They thought. So they thought and they thought. And then together they thought, I know what, we know what we're going to do. They went outside and they gathered rocks and they put them all around this big circle. And they got some of the last bits of wood and they sawed it down and then narrowed it down and sanded a handle on one end. And at the other end, they used like carving knives and they cut points on the wood sticks. They invited the neighbors, they invited the family, and everybody came around to the rock circle. They had put the last of the wood there, and they started a bonfire that evening because the family, they brought graham crackers, Hershey bars, and marshmallows. Everyone enjoyed s'mores. Everyone enjoyed the stories that everyone had to tell. And the favorite story of the night was called The Old Barn.
Okay, thank you, Marion. Next, we have Sherry Anderson. She wrote her story today. Sherry is also a producer of an Auburn, California, in-person open mic program for spoken word with oral stories, reciting of poetry, or reading an author's words. Growing up in New Mexico with many aunts and uncles and cousins, Cheryl remembers sitting in the backyard with relatives, listening to the grown-ups talking about the day's events. Sometimes they told it as a funny story and stretched out the facts, turning it into a tall tale. The stories often had a moral, and the older people were passing along to the children. And in that spirit, Cheryl tells her stories. Now, today's story is one she wrote after being moved by a single sentence in a folktale book. Can't wait to hear this one. Now, this story is another example of how you can turn a bit of inspiration into your very own story. Cheryl.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, this story is called Blondie and Pauline. Now, Pauline, you can understand how she got her name because her dad was named Paul. And Blondie, he got his name because he had all this big head full of blonde hair. Now, back in the 20s, Blondie and Pauline were sharecroppers. What that meant was that they farmed land that belonged to somebody else. And at the harvest time, they would split the money with the landowner. And Blondie and Pauline's share of money was used to pay the bills that had come in over the winter. But they had to also put aside money to buy the seeds and the equipment that they would need to start again in the fall. It was a hard life. But Blondie Now, Blondie descended from those Texas men, those rough, tough guys who drank moonshine. So Blondie, you see, he made moonshine on the side for just a little extra bucks. He thought the landowner would never miss a few ears of corn here and there. So this one afternoon, Blondie and Pauline are out in the corn patch and they're plucking and pulling corn down to make moonshine. And Pauline says, Blondie, come over here. And she shows him this beautiful ear of corn. It's about a foot long. It's golden yellow. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, except about half of it is gone. Somebody ate it. And Pauline looks at it and she says, I think we got bugs. And Blondie says, Pauline, that's not bugs. That's rabbits eating our corn. Now, about this time, a big old jackrabbit walked out of the corn row and sat down about 25 feet from them, and he's just sitting there smirking at them. Well, it was a big old jackrabbit. He was about the size of a hound dog. But Blondie took off after him, and that jackrabbit ran, and Blondie ran until he ran out of breath. And when he stopped to take a breath, there were 3 or 4, or 5 or 6, half a dozen or more jackrabbits looking at him. So he walked back to where Pauline was, and he says, honey, we got a rabbit infestation. he went up to the house to get a shotgun. He was going to take care of those mean old rabbits. Well, the next morning, found them down at Cook's Feed and Seed. And Bob Cook, he came walking over to where they were standing. Now, they were standing in front of a display of cages full of fowl. And these little birds were about the size of quail. They had bleedy little black eyes and a beak that kind of had a hook to it. They were ugly too. But they had a sign. There was a sign at the top of the stack of cages. It says, "These are the Australian ooh birds. These are the only birds in the world that lay square eggs." So Bob comes over and he says, y'all folks got that rabbit infestation out at your farm? Pauline and Blondie, yeah. Well, this is what you need. Rabbits can't stand ooh birds. He says, and these little ladies are so cheap to keep. These little ladies eat dirt. Well, the end of the story is that Blondie and Pauline went home with a red-headed rooster and 20 laying ooh birds. So the next morning, Pauline watched Blondie as he stacked up these birds on his tractor, and he went out in the cornfield and he put an ooh bird here, an ooh bird there, an ooh bird there, ooh bird there, an ooh bird there, and he put the rooster right in the middle of the field. Well, that seemed like they were really excited to get rid of the rabbits. The next morning at dawn, the ooh rooster crowed, and it wasn't long after that the hens started laying their square eggs. Ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, as 20 square eggs hit the dirt. Well, now let's talk about jackrabbits here now for a minute. Jackrabbits have these big old ears that are receptors for sound. The sound came and that would hit that big old jackrabbit's ear, and it would go down into that little cranium, and that sound would bounce around back and forth like a marble in a cardboard box. Well, that just drove those jackrabbits crazy. And it wasn't long till that whole infestation moved on to somebody else's field. Now, you might think that's the end of the story about Blondie and Pauline, but it's not. See, after the harvest that year, they packed up all their